Yeah, so whenever you're ready,
I'm set.
go for it. It's all you.
Okay. Well, to begin, you have, when you look at that area, and particularly Tuskegee, it has an interesting history, but it's a history that is based on negatives in many respects. What I mean by that is Booker T. Washington, for example, started Tuskegee, was known as Tuskegee Institute, now known as Tuskegee University. Washington, a former slave, opened up Tuskegee in that area because of a great need for education, higher education in that area. After the Civil War, you had a variety of historically Black colleges and universities get started. Howard University, Grambling got started, Jackson State in Mississippi got started. And the Tuskegee area was a perfect place to begin, an area for higher education, a place for higher education. And so Booker T. Washington, a person who in many respects was somewhat controversial, but I get him, opened things up. He and his students actually had to physically build themselves the university before they get started with their classes. In other words, there were no buildings there. So Washington and his students built the buildings. Washington was a guy who believed, or at least preached, that Black people should not worry about social equality or the right to vote or anything like that. Just prove to the white man that they were deserving of this. And so he encouraged Black people to stay in the South, work with their hands, to get an industrial education as opposed to a liberal arts education. That is, liberal arts education meaning becoming doctors, lawyers, teachers, what have you, as opposed to an industrial education, which basically meant getting involved in manufacturing and things like that. And they also encouraged the white men who owned these companies to hire these Black people. Well, the way things worked out, they did not hire Black people. And Washington, who is viewed as an accommodationist, became quite bitter in his later years, and being somewhat militant actually in his beliefs when things that he wanted to happen did not happen. Now, in his defense, when it came to the right to vote and social equality and all of that, one must understand that Washington himself Washington was in the South. He knew where he was. And so being in Alabama, you cannot go ahead and preach equality, whether it's economic, whether it's social, or what have you. But he also had very wealthy white benefactors who supported Tuskegee. And to his credit, Washington did not pocket the money for himself. He used it for Tuskegee, and he secretly funneled up some of the money back north to fund lawsuits for Black people to get the right to vote and social equality and things like this. So Washington was actually a benefactor for civil rights, unbeknownst to a lot of people. But again, though, Tuskegee was begun because of the fact that Black people were not allowed to have an education during slavery. When you get into the Tuskegee Airmen, another interesting situation here, and the Tuskegee Airmen became really the best pilots in World War II. They were first of all, they were very well trained, better trained than the white pilots, because the military had no place to put them. They didn't want them really, so they stayed at Tuskegee and trained. But when they left Tuskegee, they went to North Africa, and it eventually became essentially the pilots that protected the bombers. And when they had the bombing of Berlin late in the war, the Tuskegee Airmen were requested by the white pilots because of the fact that, again, they were supposed to protect the bombers. And they did not lose a single plane. The Tuskegee Airmen did not lose a single bomber to enemy aircraft. Now, understand the stuff coming from the ground, yes, bombers did go down, but to German airplanes, they never lost a single one. So that's quite an accomplishment. But again, you have the Tuskegee Airmen made possible because of discrimination and public pressure put on the military to let Black men fly these planes. So we get to the Tuskegee Syphilis experiment. You have to understand that there were certain beliefs that many whites had about Black people. For example, in Cuba, the Spanish-American War, Black troops were wanted by the military in Cuba because of this crazy belief that they're immune to tropical diseases. If you go back in the days of slavery, there is a belief that Blacks and whites were separate species. That was something, of course, the whole idea of separate species is that they cannot procreate. So obviously they are the same species. So when you get to the 1920s and 1930s, you have to understand that racial prejudice, was rampant. And when it came to sexual health, it was pretty apparent that, the racism was pretty broad here. So you still had scientists claiming that Black people were separate species and that the negative effects really sort of continued these scientific studies, throughout the America in the 19th century and in the 20th. So therefore, so scientific, and a lot of these public officials began to claim that, well, Black men have larger genitals, higher sex drive, and so than white people, and therefore more prone to catch sexually transmitted diseases. So also they believe that Black men would not look for the opportunity to get any STDs treated. So with all this going on, they began what became known as the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. I believe that's what the report was called. And so the goal, therefore, was just to see how they would react to syphilis. Now, they did not, as far as I know, they did not inject syphilis into these individuals, but Macon County had a very high rate of STDs, especially syphilis and gonorrhea. From what I read someplace, maybe 40% of the population had sexually transmitted disease. So you'll find here that the scientists believed that, well, if Black people are more significantly impacted by syphilis, then let's see what it does. So they picked this area called, the Black Belt.
Hold on real quick. So sorry to interrupt your
No problem.
In the zone, but I think I want to do a little bit of just background on, I know that at least reading the Fred Gray book, he said that studies on these diseases were pretty popular, and people were really into trying to figure out just STIs in general, do the research on it. I know that it was years before they realized or found a way to figure out what was causing syphilis, and then years to figure out how to test for it and everything like that. I know that one Norwegian study that he referenced was a syphilis study done where I think it kind of inspired at least the structure for the Tuskegee experiment. And essentially they found that, I don't want to get too far into what syphilis is, but I think that kind of might have piqued the curiosity of just the effects of it going untreated. Just to see, like, through that period of 15 to 40 years of, neurosyphilis, cardiovascular syphilis, you got people who are just benign for years. And I think that I just want to open up and just say that research around, the area of sexually transmitted infections or diseases was huge. And it wasn't just an out of nowhere type of, target Black people figured out. It was, at least, I'm not going to, from their perspective, it was medically relevant. It was scientifically relevant, just because of inspiring or studies that had previously inspired this type of format.
That's true. And a good point. That is all true. And in fact, you think about this, one of the reasons why this area was selected was because it's rural. You're not near major news outlets. Most of these guys were sharecroppers. They're not well educated, and you had a very high rate of illiteracy. Therefore, they were not able to really figure out what was going on and protect themselves. So, in other words, it was the ideal situation for this experiment here. And so, one person viewed this as a ready-made laboratory. Okay. You figure, okay, they have low intelligence. It really wasn't an intelligence aspect. They're, these are people just not well educated.
Yeah.
They viewed them as being low intelligence. The economic conditions were not very good at all. And that the belief that they were promiscuous sexually. So therefore, and so they felt that they would be indifferent when it came to treatment. Now, the key thing here is the fact that they went ahead and enlisted a Black nurse named Eunice Rivers to be a part of this, and she was sort of the go-between, between the patients and the doctors here.
Yeah, and also I think the Tuskegee Institute in general.
Yes, yes.
It was a huge, like, all that credibility. I think to your point, it was a perfect laboratory setup. You have that Black nurse who, I know that, people have different thoughts on her, but the credibility of having a Black nurse, having the Tuskegee Institute, and also the Rosenwald Fund there, you have all this credibility with Black people who aren't too educated but trust these people in these institutions. So
exactly. And and the funny part about this whole thing, if you can laugh, is that you had some of the patients who were, well, I don't know if I want to do this or not, because they suspected that they were being examined for military recruitment, okay, military duty. And the funny thing about that,
oh yeah, they were excused
military didn't want them.
Yeah.
They want Black people.
Yeah.
So
when they did go to the military, I mean, years down the road, when I think the treatment for when penicillin was invented, or when they were enlisted or were allowed, because I guess victims or people part of the study weren't allowed to receive treatment,
right,
they were actually kicked out of the military. So like this study actually kept them out of the military.
Exactly.
General, so
exactly. So so they went ahead and so they included women and children, just because you're not going to put women and children in the military, not in those days anyway. So especially when it comes to women, not necessarily kids. So the Great Depression got worse and worse. So that's another thing as well. This is during the Great Depression. At least it started during the Great Depression, and when people are really hurting, therefore they were promised free medical care. Eventually, they were promised hot meals on days that they were examined. So, therefore, when we look at some of these benefits, they were sort of ready-made, if you will. And so, therefore, it was easy to get them to volunteer, much easier to get them to volunteer to do this. So, as you pointed out, this experiment went on for 40 years. They recruited, several hundred Black men. Most of them had syphilis. And so those who did not have syphilis were, I guess the best way to put it was like a control group. Okay. So they're given placebos to continue the belief that they were being treated when in fact they were not. And they were never really told what this is all about. So that really, in a nutshell, that's really what the Tuskegee Syphilis experiment was about. The participants were never provided information or enough information so they could give an informed consent. Okay. They withheld information about the disease, the true purpose of the experiment. And so, they just were not told. So therefore, everything was done in bad faith. All they were told was that they were being treated for bad blood, and that bad blood could be anything, a number of illnesses could result from quote unquote bad blood. So, so they were never told what this is all about, what they're being treated for, or anything like that. When, it was determined that penicillin was an effective cure, they still did not use it on these patients. And as a result of all that, you had people who pretty much lived lives infected by syphilis until they died. Several dozen had wives who were infected by syphilis by their husbands, and 19 of their children had the disease passed down as well. So, and the key thing here is that the officials made sure that the victims were not treated for syphilis, and that really was the key thing.
Right.
One of the key things anyway.
Right. Well, I think that obviously up to this point, I mean, I know that, so prior to penicillin, the treatment for pretty much anything was kind of worse than what they were trying to cure in the first place. So I remember when I think during World War I or early 20th century, when aspirin became a thing, they use aspirin to treat everything.
Hmm.
Specifically for syphilis, a lot of the treatments were mercurial and
Hmm.
toxic to your system, and so staying out of treatment wasn't necessarily a bad idea in my opinion. At that point, like, why would you want mercury in your system as opposed to just trying to get through syphilis or get through syphilis?
Hmm.
And I think that you can, at least from a scientific mind in that time and era, you could at least justify withholding treatment and doing a long observation study, even though it is obviously racist and obviously targeted. But I think the moment penicillin became widely used and known, that in the mid to late 1940s, that is when I think the study ran out of excuses. And then at that point, when you're withholding treatment for the next 15 to 20 years, or 25 years, really, I think that's when you hit those problems of what is your objective here, because there's really no point in my opinion on having a long observational study on the untreated effects of penicillin past the 15-year mark if there's already a cure or a treatment for it, right? Like
Right,
that's
exactly.
kind of where it comes into play. And I think that the numbers for the study were 201 control group non-infected, even though I think that when they would get infected they just move over to the a study group, and I think 399 originally in the placebo group.
Right.
And I think that should we go over some details of the study, or do you want to just go over the effects or the aftermath? Or because I think, I guess we don't have to go too far deep into it. I mean, I think there are resources that people can look up if they want, but
Sure.
essentially, an overview, it was a
Right.
study done by the government. Wait, what? So,
But there is one other thing to keep in
yeah.
mind here. This is also done in Guatemala by the Americans.
Mm.
Um, in 1946 or so, the National Institute of Health, I think it was, funded a study, and they got Guatemalan authorities to cooperate, where these American doctors went down to Guatemala and deliberately infected over 5,000 people with venereal disease, okay, syphilis, gonorrhea, what have you, just to see the effects. They included they infected children, they infected prostitutes, they infected they infected the leprosy patients, mental patients, prisoners, soldiers as well. And this went on for 2 or 3 years here. They intentionally infected at least 1,300 people with syphilis and gonorrhea. And they studied 5,000 people altogether. Okay.
Mhm.
Um, so, the study was supposed to have been done originally in Indiana, but they couldn't find enough prisoners to do the experiments. So they went down to Guatemala. And so they were the ones who were deliberately infected. They get a needle and inject them or what have you. There's one patient in particular, a woman, and she was infected in her left arm with syphilis, and then sometime later, she was reinfected with syphilis because of the fact that they put gonorrhea pus, believe it or not, from a male subject into both of her eyes. So they, like with eye drops, put gonorrhea pus into this woman's eyes. And so her eyes were filled with pus, and she was bleeding from her private parts, and eventually died. So, Barack Obama, when Obama was president, they officially apologized to the Guatemalan people, but to this date, there's been nothing done to compensate the victims or their families.
Mhm. It took decades to compensate the families of the American, so
Exactly,
it's probably not going to happen for the Guatemalan.
exactly. Well, the person you referenced, Freddie Gray, was a lawyer.
Yeah, he was
and,
the
he
lead representative. Yeah.
represented the families and won a $9 million judgment, which probably is not enough money, but still, he did that. So those are some of the things that went on with these experiments.
Yeah. I think that I don't know. I think that when we look back, obviously, it's really easy to, even from a scientific point of view, just point out all the flaws and the mistakes, but that just comes with, I guess, the
Sure.
evolution and the acquisition of knowledge. But I think some housekeeping. Males were chosen because of the penis, just because they assumed that it'd be easier to observe syphilis conditions or symptoms, and also that theoretically men would be able to give a more accurate timeline of when they acquired syphilis because of the external reproductive organ, which apparently is false, or which is false. And also, I guess just the design was, just lacking, useful information. They kind of it just really seems reckless. I mean, obviously it is reckless, but it reminds me of like when you were a little kid and you kind of just, throw something in something else to see what happens. Like you throw Mentos and Diet Coke and just watch. I think that, obviously it was racially targeted, but it was just not very well done. And I know that, past a certain point when I know IRB or, revision boards are now, for any type of experiment involving humans, like even in college, if you want to do, an experiment or, a long survey for a research project, you have to get some sort of IRB approval, which was always kind of a boring process at Case Western. But, I think that just what amazed me was how the government still defended this, when they were taken to court for legal action, despite the fact that you had, penicillin available, you had the Nuremberg codes, which protected human rights. And I don't know, it was just really, really shocking that they even attempted a legitimate defense. And just, I highly recommend people check out the book by Fred Gray. And he does a really good job just breaking down everything that goes into it. And just like how he framed the lawsuit. I think he did not include that black nurse, actually. I don't think, do you remember? I don't know. He did not include the black nurse. I'm looking it up right now. I don't think he did, right? No. He did not include the black nurse because he kind of saw her as a victim of this as well. She was kind of doing her job. And I think he also discluded the Tuskegee Institute for similar reasons of, you have the government here giving you money to use your, resources and use your area, and you're in the middle of the depression. Like, you're kind of tied there. So victims of circumstance were kind of how he, I guess, chose who he was going to take action against. But yeah, the book is The Tuskegee Syphilis Study by Fred Gray. And I think there is a book called Bad Blood that I did not read, but I think that would be a good one too.
Okay.
And talking about the legacy of it, I think one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about it is just because you hear the name being evoked, the Tuskegee experiment, with anti-vax people who are comparing the mass vaccine mandates to the Tuskegee experiment. And I just feel like it was important to, explicitly state that it is not at all similar.
You're right. It's a weak comparison.
Yeah, it's not even conceptually similar. I think it's pretty obvious. But if it was going to be similar, it'd have to be the government offering, a treatment for COVID and then giving you, some placebo and then watching it take effect. Like that would be what the equivalent would be. It wouldn't be, them giving us a vaccine and that's it. Like
they help prevent it.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
They were at, you have certain people who just reach for any straw.
Yeah.
Grasp any straw to justify their beliefs. If they're afraid of a needle, just say, I'm afraid of a needle. Crying out loud.
Yeah, that's rough. But there are, I think, a couple, there's a couple questions, but there's one long one that I want to do. You said that current medical research fails to address real health needs of Black people because some researchers claim that it's hard to recruit Black folks, which is
understandable.
Especially given the Tuskegee experiment and all that type of stuff. Although that's a lot of blaming the victim of, it's hard to recruit them, like it's their fault. Other researchers are afraid to try to work specifically with Black populations because Black people deserve to not have to face another horrific experience. And those are both pretty lame excuses, in the words of my professor, which I agree with. And she just wants to hear like our opinion on how the Tuskegee experiment still affects the evidence-based healthcare that Black folks can expect. And that's kind of what I want to touch on anyway, is just, how the Tuskegee experiment has impacted, or, the legacy of it, as far as how it applies to Black populations, the medical field, and distrust I know that, for example, Black women, mortality rate of, birth, for example, are higher. I know that, that we see racial inequality in the medical field, not just by numbers, but also by anecdotal evidence of, concerns and comments just taken less seriously when relayed from Black people to doctors and health personnel. So I guess just our opinions, or I guess you could start off or continue from me on just how this has impacted, Black people and the dynamic between the government or just medicine or science in general with
Well,
Black people.
I think I'll come from the perspective of medicine, really, and this goes beyond the Tuskegee experiment. A lot of Black people don't even know about it, but they have their own experiences. So, giving like when you were born, when your siblings were born, and whenever we needed a doctor, we never had a problem, probably because it was a function of where we lived,
Mhm.
and so that's an important thing there. Here, where we live right now, your great uncle has gone to hospital on several occasions, not in the last couple of years, but whenever we called an ambulance, I'm still talking to them with the address. They're at the front door. I mean, they're here in
Mhm.
a hurry. But the experiences of many Black people is such that they don't show up. You call an ambulance, and if they do show up, they're an hour later. They show up an hour after you call, and so you also have had situations, even with COVID, as recently as COVID, where a Black person will have the symptoms but get turned away. Well, you don't have COVID. You just had the flu. Go home, and the person dies of COVID. So when you're talking about a Tuskegee experiment, or really the legacy when it comes to medicine, you have to look at the totality of experiences, so that these stories get handed down from generation to generation, about the issues they've had with poor medical care, even if they have very good insurance, poor medical care or non-existent medical care. And so when you talk about the legacy of Tuskegee, the legacy is just a part of what has actually happened over the decades. And again, this whole idea that Black lives do not matter, or they do not matter as much as lives of others. So, so that really is, when you're talking about the distrust that they had when it came to the vaccine at first, when it came to going to hospital, this is all part of this whole thing about, well, they just don't care. And so so therefore you have that kind of issue where it just gets passed on, and then people therefore will not seek the medical care that they really need, even those who want to get the care are sincere.
Mhm.
It is something in which people are just totally skeptical about. Again, in our situation, we've never had a problem, but a lot of other people that I know have had problems. And so, and that it all comes back to the medical care and the attitude toward Black people in general.
Yeah, and I think that even without the Tuskegee experiment, I mean, obviously, I think that it was a kind of a powder keg moment because it all came out, when it broke
Sure,
surface in
sure.
1972, it was this huge like boom, like this has been going on under our noses.
Mhm.
But, I think that the poor treatment and medical care and just experimentation on Black people, definitely predates the Tuskegee experiment, go
Sure.
back to times of slavery, just, the inhumane things that I'm sure aren't even documented. I mean, can you imagine like the horrors that went on just because,
Mhm.
some guy with some tools and pliers, got bored or was
Yeah.
curious, right? Like, it really, I don't think it's that hard to imagine for the worst reasons. But I do think that it is frustrating because I definitely lived in a pretty privileged, not bubble, but I think that, areas that we lived in were really responsive. And I think that you and mom always did the best you can to provide us with, the best resources and the best care,
Mhm.
thankfully. And so I was kind of surprised when I first heard of all this distrust from, Black friends of mine, or just when I heard like these ideas of distrust amongst the Black community. And looking
Mhm.
back, I think it makes a lot of sense. Just
Sure.
thinking
Yeah.
back to when Black people first arrived on this continent, or taken to this continent.
Mhm.
And I think that it's definitely really frustrating, but given the low vaccination rates of Black people, it's definitely still there. And I think that there was even a survey in 1999 where I think a fair amount of Black men or Black people believed that Black men were infected with syphilis for the study. Like it wasn't even like a, hey, let's find people with syphilis. There are
Mhm.
people who genuinely believe that it was injected into them, which
Mhm.
I definitely will not eliminate from the realm of possibility, because that is definitely something I can see happening for
Sure.
sure. But I think that we talked about it earlier, but I think a huge part that also makes this frustrating, and I don't want to blame the victim here, but just, you know, the exploitation of credibility and using the credibility of, Black nurses and the Tuskegee Institute just really, I
Yeah.
think, hammered it home too. Because if you can't trust, your neighbor, or, that nice Black nurse that's been giving you free meals, or, reassuring you that, hey, like we're good here, like we got you, like
Mhm.
that, that's, you're not gonna trust anybody at that point, right? Like you're gonna go off of, your uncle on Facebook when he Googles something that is 100% false.
Sure.
So, I think it's very unfortunate, and I think that, like most things, proper education can fix this, but our education system sucks, and it's even worse in poor areas that have been redlined, which is a completely different issue altogether.
And then you have
Yeah,
people who are just not educated, who just do not know.
yeah,
And
that's what I think is really frustrating.
yes,
Yeah,
so that's what
because
they're counting on with the Tuskegee victims, and really, for that matter, the Guatemalans as well.
yeah, and I think that doing it's just the blatant. I mean, this is always going to come back to that a tick of white supremacy of that, it's not us, it's fine, right? Or,
Right.
and
Exactly.
obviously I do think in the tax bracket, or tax bracket, the poor and the non-white will always be the victims, and more
Mhm.
often than not it'll be the poor non-whites that are the victims.
Mhm.
And it's kind of set up that way.
Yes, indeed.
um but I think that, and there are a couple of just basic FAQs about the Tuskegee experiment that we can answer in a follow-up, or that can be just reiterated or answered with what we spoke about already.
Mhm.
But I think that's good.